There was no vote, no congressional approval, no public hearing, no debate watched by the press. A city of hundreds of thousands of people was selected for destruction by a small group of officials working through the atomic bomb program's committees. Not on the battlefield, not on Japan's open Pacific coast, in an office. And many of them had never set foot in Japan. That is the first thing you have to understand about what happened in the spring of 1945. The selection of Hiroshima as the target for the first atomic bomb used in warfare was not a spontaneous battlefield decision. It was a deliberate, methodical process, carried out by a committee. And the way that committee arrived at Hiroshima, the arguments, the criteria, the cities they considered and rejected, is one of the less discussed parts of the decision story. Most people know the bomb was dropped. Fewer know how the target was chosen. And almost no one asks the question that should have been raised decades ago: why Hiroshima and not somewhere else? Because Hiroshima was not the obvious choice. It was not the largest city in Japan. It was not the most strategically vital. It was not the most symbolically important. There were other cities on the list, cities that were bigger, more industrially significant, more culturally loaded. And they were all passed over. Some were eliminated for reasons that sound almost absurd: weather patterns, sight lines, the angle of prevailing winds. One city, one of the most historically important cities in Japan, was removed from the target list after internal debate following Stimson's intervention and approval at the highest levels. Not because of a military calculation, because of what would be lost if that city no longer existed. That is the pivot point of this story. Not the physics of the bomb, not the casualties, not the surrender. The question of how a small group of men, with almost no public accountability, decided which place on Earth would cease to exist, and why the process that led them to that decision has been so thoroughly overshadowed by everything that came after. To understand why Hiroshima was chosen, you first have to understand the structure that made the choice possible in the first place. By the spring of 1945, the United States had been at war with Japan for over 3 years. The fighting in the Pacific had turned brutal in ways the American public barely grasped. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Battle after battle, tens of thousands of American soldiers killed or wounded in engagements that seemed, from the outside, to accomplish nothing except moving the front lines slightly closer to the Japanese home islands. The war was grinding toward an ending that military planners feared could cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives. On both sides, if it came to a full invasion of Japan. Into that context, the atomic bomb arrived, and it was not simply a bigger version of an existing weapon. It was something no one had ever seen, and no one had ever had to account for. One device. One city. Erased. The Manhattan Project, the secret program that had developed the bomb, had been running since 1942. By early 1945, the scientists and engineers working on it were confident the weapon would function. The question shifted from whether it could be built to something far more consequential: where would it be used? That question did not go to the public. It did not go to Congress. It went to a small group of military officials and civilian advisors operating under extreme wartime secrecy. Most Americans in 1945 did not know the Manhattan Project existed. The committee members tasked with selecting the target were not famous names. They were not battlefield commanders. They were planners, administrators, intelligence analysts, and they had been given a scope of authority that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. But the war had created its own internal logic. But how far did that logic actually reach? That power was not contested. not formally at least. Wartime had compressed the normal channels of oversight into near invisibility. Decisions that in peacetime would have required public deliberation, legislative debate, or at minimum a broader circle of informed advisors were being made inside a classification envelope so tight that even members of Congress on key defense committees did not know the weapon existed. The men making the target selection were answerable, in theory, to the Secretary of War and ultimately to the President. But the secrecy that shielded the program also shielded the decision. No outside voice could challenge a recommendation it did not know had been made. This was not unique to the atomic bomb. Wartime military planning had always operated under restricted visibility. Target selection for conventional bombing raids was not a matter of public debate. But there was a difference in scale that made the comparison almost meaningless. Choosing which military airfield to strike was one order of magnitude. Choosing which city, with its entire civilian population, would be erased from existence was something else entirely. And the institutional structures that governed the decision had not been built to bear that weight. Here is what makes the target selection story genuinely strange. The criteria the committee developed were not purely military. They were not purely strategic. Some of them were almost scientific, as if the decision were being treated as an experiment rather than an act of war. The men in that room were not simply choosing a city to destroy. They were choosing a city to measure. That distinction is critical, because it means the target was selected not only for how much damage the bomb would inflict, but for how clearly that damage could be observed, documented, and assessed after the fact. The bomb needed a target that could serve as a controlled demonstration, which meant the target city had to meet a very specific set of conditions. And here is where the logic becomes deeply uncomfortable. The United States military had spent months conducting massive firebombing raids across Japan. City after city had been reduced to ash and rubble: Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama. The firebombing campaign killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians across dozens of cities. But for the atomic bomb, for this single weapon, the military needed a city that had not yet been touched, a city that was still standing, still intact, so that when it was destroyed, the before and after comparison would be unmistakable. The bomb needed a clean target, and that requirement, the need for a city that conventional bombing had spared, fundamentally shaped which cities were even eligible for consideration. What clean target meant in practice was more specific than it might first appear. Certain cities were deliberately spared major bombing, so the new weapon's effects could be measured against an intact urban target. The logic was this: if you intend to use a single weapon to demonstrate total destruction, you need a city where total destruction has not already occurred. You need the original city still in place, the buildings, the streets, the neighborhoods, so that the weapon's effects can be measured against an intact baseline. That meant some Japanese cities were being spared from conventional bombing, not out of mercy or strategic irrelevance, but as future test subjects. In effect, those cities were being kept intact so the bomb's impact could be clearly observed and measured. The firebombing exemption was not protection. It was preparation. That realization, when it emerges from the documents, reframes the entire target selection as something closer to experimental design than to battlefield tactics. The Target Committee was an ad hoc, interagency group tied to the atomic bomb program with named participants and a defined mission. It operated more like a working group within the larger Manhattan Project bureaucracy. Its membership shifted somewhat over time, but the core participants included senior military officers, scientists from the Manhattan Project, and intelligence analysts who specialized in Japanese military and industrial capabilities. General Leslie Groves, the Manhattan Project director, oversaw the committee's work but did not chair every meeting. The day-to-day deliberations were managed by officers who reported directly to Groves and who understood with unusual clarity both the weapon's technical capabilities and the strategic context in which it would be used. These were not men who stumbled into the decision. They had been preparing for it, in one form or another, for months. The process of assembling the target list began in earnest in the spring of 1945. Teams of military analysts reviewed aerial reconnaissance photographs of Japanese cities. They assessed population density and urban layout. They evaluated industrial output and military infrastructure. They examined geographic features, coastlines, river valleys, surrounding terrain. And they began compiling a short list of cities that met the committee's requirements. The reconnaissance work was painstaking and granular in ways that reveal how seriously the committee treated the selection as a technical problem. Analysts examined photographs taken at different altitudes and seasons, comparing the density of rooftops, the width of streets, the spacing between industrial districts and residential areas. They mapped the percentage of a city's core that remained structurally sound, distinguishing between buildings that had been destroyed, buildings that had been damaged but were still standing, and buildings that were completely untouched. A city that had already been heavily damaged was, by the committee standards, no longer a viable target. The measurement would be contaminated. The before and after comparison would be muddied. The analysts were not deciding, in any human sense, which city deserved to be destroyed. They were solving an optimization problem: maximize blast exposure area against an intact urban grid, while maintaining atmospheric and geographic conditions favorable to post-strike assessment. It was the language of engineering applied to the destruction of a populated place. The initial pool of cities under consideration was larger than most popular accounts suggest. More than a dozen cities were evaluated at various stages of the process. But the list contracted quickly. Many cities were eliminated because they had already been targeted by firebombing campaigns and were no longer sufficiently intact. Others were too small to produce a convincing demonstration of the weapon's power. A handful were ruled out for geographic or atmospheric reasons. Locations where wind patterns, humidity, or coastal geography might interfere with the detonation or complicate post-strike assessment. By spring 1945, the working shortlist had been reduced to a small number of candidates. But which one stood above the rest? And one of those candidates was Kyoto. Kyoto's presence on the target list is one of the most consequential details in the entire story, because Kyoto, in many respects, was the strongest candidate on the list. It was one of the largest cities in Japan that had not been significantly damaged by firebombing raids. Its population was around 1 million. It was a functioning industrial center. And it carried a symbolic weight that no other city on the shortlist could match. Kyoto had served as the imperial capital of Japan for over 1,000 years. The temples, the shrines, the cultural traditions that defined Japanese identity for centuries, a massive concentration of them existed within Kyoto's boundaries. From a military standpoint, the destruction of Kyoto would have communicated something far beyond the physical elimination of buildings and population. It would have signaled the end of Japanese civilization as a coherent cultural entity, and the target committee appears to have recognized that symbolic power. Kyoto was on the working list. It met the technical criteria. So why was it removed? The removal of Kyoto from the target list is the moment where the story shifts from military planning to something closer to political decision-making. And the key figure in that shift was Henry Stimson. Stimson was the Secretary of War, the senior civilian official overseeing the entire U.S. military establishment during the war. He was not a military man himself. He was a lawyer, a career diplomat and government official who had served under multiple presidents. And, crucially, he had visited Japan before the war. Stimson had visited Japan before the war. He had seen its cities, walked through neighborhoods, observed the way daily life was structured around cultural and religious institutions. He understood Japan as a place, not merely as an adversary to be defeated on a map. When Stimson learned that Kyoto was under consideration as a target, he intervened. And what he did next changed everything. Directly and forcefully, he argued that Kyoto had to be removed from the list. His reasoning was not strategic in the conventional sense. It was cultural. Stimson argued Kyoto's cultural and historical significance made it an unacceptable target, and he argued that such an act would make the post-war relationship between the United States and Japan functionally impossible. Japan, Stimson believed, would need to be rebuilt as a functioning nation after the war. A stable, cooperative Japan served American interests in the long term, but a Japan that had lost its cultural center, that had been stripped of the very thing that made it a coherent civilization, could not be rebuilt into anything stable. Stimson's argument was not, at its core, about compassion for Japanese civilians. It was about long-term geopolitical strategy, but the effect was the same. Kyoto was removed from the target list. And it was never seriously reconsidered. That decision raises an uncomfortable question. If the logic that saved Kyoto was about preserving Japan's capacity to function as a nation after the war, then why did that logic not apply to every other city on the list? Why was cultural and civilizational preservation the deciding factor for Kyoto, but not for Hiroshima or for Nagasaki, or for any of the other cities that remained under consideration? The answer, in part, is that Kyoto was unique. No other city on the shortlist carried the same depth of cultural significance. Hiroshima was important. It was militarily significant. But it was not the spiritual center of Japanese civilization. Destroying Hiroshima would be devastating, catastrophic by any measure. But it would not, in Stimson's framework, destroy the foundation upon which Japan could be rebuilt. That distinction between a city that was militarily important and a city that was culturally irreplaceable shaped the final target selection in ways that go far beyond simple military logic. But Stimson's intervention raises a second question, one that the historical record does not fully answer. Did anyone on the committee push back? Did any of the military officers or Manhattan Project scientists argue that Stimson's reasoning was inconsistent? That if cultural preservation was a legitimate ground for removing a city from the target list, it should have been applied more broadly? In the surviving records, that kind of objection is hard to find, stated plainly, which suggests something about the power dynamics inside the room. Stimson was not merely offering an opinion. He was the Secretary of War. His authority over military target selection was formal and unambiguous. When he said Kyoto should come off the list, it came off the list. And the men around him, men who had spent months developing the technical criteria, men who had assessed Kyoto's viability against every standard the committee had established, deferred. Not because his argument was irrefutable on its own terms, but because the structure of authority made disagreement with him on a matter this consequential effectively impossible. That dynamic, the way a single senior official's judgment could override a months-long technical process, is itself a revealing detail about how the decision was actually made. And it leaves open a question that Stimson's own records do not resolve. He knew, by that point, which other cities remained on the shortlist. He knew what would happen to them, and he chose to intervene only for Kyoto. What that silence meant, whether it was a deliberate calculation or simply the boundary of what one man believed he could defend, is one of the gaps the documents cannot fill. There was also a psychological dimension to the target selection that the committee appears to have considered, though it receives less attention in most historical accounts than the military and scientific criteria. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon designed to kill people and destroy infrastructure. It was, by its very nature, a weapon designed to shock. The scale of destruction it could produce in a single strike, the sheer, visible, undeniable totality of it, was intended to have an effect that went beyond the immediate casualties. The target needed to be a place that, when destroyed, would communicate the weapon's power in terms that the Japanese government could not dismiss or minimize. A small, obscure city would not have served that purpose. The destruction had to be visible. It had to be dramatic. It had to be unmistakable. And the target needed to be large enough, populated enough, recognizable enough, that the gap between what existed before and what remained after would be impossible to rationalize away. Hiroshima, as a city of 350, people with a clearly defined urban core, met that standard. It was large enough to demonstrate the weapon's power convincingly, but not so large, not so culturally irreplaceable, that its destruction would trigger the kind of civilizational objections that had removed Kyoto from consideration. It occupied a specific middle ground, significant enough to matter, expendable enough in the minds of the men making the choice to use. By late May 1945, the target recommendation had moved up the chain of command. It was no longer solely in the hands of the target committee. The broader decision, whether to use the bomb, how to use it, and against what target, was being deliberated by a body called the Interim Committee. The Interim Committee was a civilian advisory group chaired by Secretary of War Stimson. Its purpose was to advise President Harry Truman on the use of the atomic weapon. And the committee's deliberations covered far more ground than simply target selection. One of the central questions before the Interim Committee was whether the atomic bomb should be used at all, or whether an alternative approach might achieve the same goal. The alternative that received the most serious consideration was a demonstration. A controlled detonation in a visible location witnessed by Japanese observers. The idea was straightforward: show Japan what the weapon could do, without actually dropping it on a populated city. If the demonstration was convincing enough, if the Japanese government saw the destruction and understood that the next bomb would fall on a major city, the war might end without a direct strike on civilians. It was not an unreasonable proposal, and it was debated seriously within the Interim Committee, but the demonstration option was ultimately rejected. And the reasons for that rejection reveal the practical anxieties that dominated the decision-making at every level. The primary concern was not humanitarian. It was operational. What if the demonstration failed? What if the bomb did not detonate as expected? Or the blast was smaller than anticipated? Or weather conditions obscured the explosion? At the time many of these deliberations were made, the weapon had not yet been tested. The first full-scale test came in July 1945. The weapon was, in a very real sense, unproven in a combat environment. A failed demonstration would have been a catastrophic strategic error. It would have revealed to Japan and to every other nation watching that the United States possessed this weapon, had attempted to use it, and had failed. The credibility cost of that outcome, the committee decided, was unacceptable. Better to use the bomb directly on a target where its effects would be undeniable than to risk a failed demonstration that achieved nothing except exposing the weapon's existence. That logic, the fear of failure outweighing the moral weight of a direct strike on a populated city, shaped the final decision in a way that is difficult to overstate. But there was a deeper problem with the demonstration concept that the committee identified, and it was almost impossibly uncomfortable to articulate. A demonstration on an uninhabited site, an empty stretch of coastline, a deserted island, would not have been convincing. The Japanese military establishment had seen massive destruction before. Firebombing raids had leveled entire districts of Tokyo. Conventional explosives could reduce buildings to rubble. What the atomic bomb could do, that no conventional weapon could do, was destroy a populated city in a single instant. That was its unique power. That was what made it different from everything that had come before. But demonstrating that power required demonstrating it against a population. A bomb detonated over an empty field would look, from the outside, like a very large conventional explosion. Impressive, certainly, but not necessarily decisive. The weapon's true shock value, the thing that could break Japan's resolve, was not the size of the blast. It was the fact that an entire city full of people had simply ceased to exist. And you could not demonstrate that without actually doing it. The demonstration option was not rejected only because it might fail. It was rejected because, to succeed, it would have had to look exactly like the thing the committee was trying to avoid, a direct strike on a populated target. The bomb would be used on a city, with no specific warning to the city. The final selection of Hiroshima involved input from several layers of the military and civilian command structure. General Leslie Groves, the Army officer who had directed the Manhattan Project from its earliest stages, was a central figure in the target discussions. Groves was a large, forceful personality who had managed the entire program through years of secrecy, political maneuvering, and scientific uncertainty. He had strong opinions about how the weapon should be used, and his views carried significant weight within the decision-making process. The 509th Composite Group, under Colonel Paul Tibbetts' command, planned the operational details for delivering the weapon. Tibbetts had been selected to command the specialized unit responsible for delivering the bomb, and he had spent months preparing for the strike. But the formal recommendation for Hiroshima came from the Target Committee's final report, issued in late May 1945. The report listed a small number of cities as recommended targets. Hiroshima appeared on that list, and the justification the committee provided aligned precisely with the criteria it had established months earlier. Hiroshima was a military headquarters city. It housed the headquarters of Japan's Second General Army and served as a major logistics center for the defense of the southern home islands. It had not been significantly targeted by firebombing, which meant it remained largely intact and could serve as a clear demonstration of the weapon's effects. Its geographic and atmospheric characteristics, particularly the need for clear weather and a visual strike, made it a viable target from an operational standpoint. And its population, substantial, but not so large as to raise the kind of civilizational objections that had removed Kyoto from the list, placed it within the boundaries of what the decision-makers considered acceptable. There is one more dimension to the target selection that complicates the narrative in ways most accounts avoid: the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, and the Soviet Union, now freed from the demands of the European theater, was preparing to shift its military attention to the Pacific. At the Yalta Conference earlier in 1945, Stalin had agreed to enter the war against Japan within a few months of Germany's surrender. Soviet entry into the Pacific War would have dramatically altered the strategic balance. It would have opened a second front for Japan, stretching across Manchuria into Korea and potentially into the northern islands of Japan itself. And it would have given the Soviet Union a substantial role in the post-war settlement in East Asia, a role that American officials were increasingly uncomfortable with. Some historians have argued that the atomic bomb was used, in part, to end the Pacific War before Soviet involvement became significant. To force Japan's surrender quickly enough that the Soviets would not have time to occupy large portions of East Asian territory and claim a dominant position in the post-war order. This interpretation is contested, but the timeline is difficult to dismiss entirely. The bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8. 2 days separated those events. Did Soviet considerations directly influence the specific choice of Hiroshima? The available documents do not say. The Target Committee's reports rarely address Soviet strategy explicitly. But the Interim Committee's deliberations, the broader political body that authorized the bomb's use, took place in a context where Soviet power was very much present in the minds of American decision-makers. And the urgency to use the bomb before Soviet entry may have shaped not just whether it was used, but when, which, in turn, constrained which targets were still viable. The target selection had been locked in weeks before the bomb was actually dropped. By the time the geopolitical pressures of late July 1945 were intensifying, Hiroshima was already the leading candidate on the list. The decision had, in a sense, already been made, even as the political context continued to shift around it. Behind that timeline was a question about authority that has never been fully settled. Harry Truman had become president less than 4 months before the bomb was dropped. He had inherited the war from Franklin Roosevelt. He had inherited the Manhattan Project. He had inherited the Target Committee's recommendation and the Interim Committee's advisory framework. Truman had not initiated the atomic weapons program. He had not participated in the Target deliberations. He had not even been told about the bomb's existence until after Roosevelt's death. By the time the weapon was ready for use, the institutional machinery that had produced the Target recommendation was already in motion. The committees had met. The criteria had been developed. The shortlist had been narrowed. The recommendation had been written. Truman's role, in practical terms, was to authorize what had already been decided, or to stop it. And stopping it, at that point in the war, would have required him to override months of classified planning by officials who understood the weapon and the strategic situation far better than he did. Whether Truman exercised genuine independent judgment over the target selection, or whether he approved a recommendation whose substance had already been fixed, remains one of the more genuinely unresolved questions in the history of the decision. The records show he was briefed. They show he did not object. But the records do not show the internal reasoning that led him to accept what he was told. By early August 1945, the operational preparations were complete. The 509th Composite Group, the specialized unit under Tibbetts' command, was stationed on the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands. The bomb components had been shipped to Tinian in stages under extraordinary security measures. The weapon was assembled. The aircraft was ready. The crew had been briefed. And on the morning of August 6, the B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian and flew north toward Japan. The flight took approximately 6 hours. The bomb was released at approximately 8:15 in the morning, local time, at an altitude of roughly 31 feet. It detonated at about 1 feet above the city, high enough that the blast wave would spread outward at ground level rather than being absorbed by the Earth. The fireball reached temperatures in the millions of degrees, often described as hotter than the sun's surface. The shock wave caused catastrophic destruction for more than a mile around the detonation point. By the end of the day, an estimated tens of thousands were dead. The city of Hiroshima, as it had existed that morning, was gone. The assessment of Hiroshima began almost immediately after the bomb was dropped. What the surveyors found was not what most people imagine. After Japan's surrender, survey teams were sent to document the destruction and collect data on the weapon's effects. The surveys were methodical and extensive. They measured the distance from the detonation point at which buildings of various types had been destroyed, damaged, or left standing. They documented the thermal effects, the burns and fires caused by the fireball's intense heat. They cataloged the blast damage, the structural collapse caused by the shockwave. And they began the grim process of estimating casualty figures. The surveyors documented things that no previous military assessment had ever recorded in this way. They found shadows burned into walls, the thermal imprint of a human body, or a fence, or a railing, seared onto concrete by a flash of heat so intense and so brief that it left a permanent silhouette where the object had blocked the light. They measured the height at which trees had been stripped of bark on the side facing the blast and calculated from that the direction and intensity of the thermal pulse. They cataloged the precise distance from ground zero at which different materials, wood, glass, concrete, steel, had failed, each at a different threshold. The precision of this record is striking, not because it was assembled with care or compassion, but because it was assembled with the same methodical attention to detail that the target selection itself had demanded. The weapon had been chosen, in part, because it could produce a clean, measurable result, and the surveyors were there to collect that measurement. The irony, if that word is even adequate, is that the documentation of Hiroshima became some of the most detailed early studies of mass civilian destruction in the nuclear age. The speed at which the decision was made, weeks of committee meetings, a short list narrowed over the course of months, stood in almost absurd contrast to the thoroughness with which its consequences were recorded afterward. The men who chose the target spent less time deliberating than the men who cataloged what the target had become. The data collected in Hiroshima, and later in Nagasaki, which was struck 3 days afterward, became foundational to the study of nuclear weapons effects for decades to come, which is, in a sense, exactly what the target committee had intended. The target selection had been designed, in part, to produce a clean, measurable result, and it did. The scientific value of the data collected from Hiroshima was enormous. It informed nuclear weapons development, civil defense planning, and military strategy for the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. The city's destruction was, from one perspective, one of the most thoroughly documented events in military history. And the way the target was selected, methodically, analytically, with an explicit eye toward post-strike measurement, is the thread that connects the measurement imperative to the historical record. What followed in the days after August 6 was more complicated than the simple narrative of "bomb dropped, war ended" suggests. Japan did not surrender immediately. The Japanese government's internal deliberations in the week between Hiroshima and the formal surrender announcement on August 15 were fractious and deeply divided. There were factions within the Japanese military and political establishment that wanted to continue fighting. that viewed the atomic bomb as one more weapon in a war that had already inflicted massive destruction on both sides. Many historians argue the Soviet entry into the war was at least as significant a factor in Japan's surrender as the bombings. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria sharply narrowed Japan's remaining options for negotiating an end to the war. Historians continue to debate the relative weight of these factors. Some argue the bomb was decisive. Others argue it was the Soviet entry that finally broke Japan's resolve. Most agree it was some combination of both, and that the story is far more tangled than either side of the debate typically acknowledges. But regardless of how the war ended, regardless of whether Hiroshima was the single decisive blow or one catalyst among several, the process by which the target was chosen remains a story fundamentally about power and accountability, or, more precisely, about the absence of accountability. The men who selected Hiroshima were not acting outside the law. There was no legal requirement in 1945 for public debate over the selection of military targets. The concept of targeting a civilian population, while morally fraught, was not, at that moment in history, a clear violation of the rules of war as they were understood. The Target Committee was operating within the institutional and legal frameworks available to it, but those frameworks had not been designed for a weapon of this scale. They had been designed for conventional warfare, for decisions about which military installations to strike, which supply lines to cut, which naval bases to bomb. The atomic bomb collapsed the boundary between military and civilian targets in a way that no previous weapon had achieved so completely. And the committee that chose Hiroshima was making a decision that the existing structures of authority and oversight simply could not accommodate. In the decades since 1945, the target selection has been studied by historians with increasing thoroughness. The documents from the Target Committee and the Interim Committee have been declassified and analyzed. The deliberations have been reconstructed from military records, post-war interviews, and the personal papers of the officials involved. And what those documents show is not a story of reckless indifference or calculated cruelty. It is a story of men trying to solve an unprecedented problem under conditions of extreme time pressure, absolute secrecy, and consequences they could only partially foresee. They knew what the bomb would do. They understood, as clearly as anyone could have, that dropping it on a populated city would kill tens of thousands of people. And they made their selection based on the criteria they had developed, the intelligence they possessed, and the strategic assumptions that defined their moment in history. Whether those assumptions were correct remains one of the most debated questions in the history of the 20th century. Whether the bomb was necessary, whether a demonstration would have worked, whether the war could have ended without it, these questions do not have settled answers. But the process that produced the decision, the quiet, methodical, almost bureaucratic selection of a target, was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of a war that had already normalized destruction on an industrial scale, carried out by institutions that had been built to prosecute that destruction efficiently. We began with an absence. No vote, no public hearing, no congressional debate. A city chosen by men whose names the world never learned, in rooms the public never entered, under a secrecy so complete that most Americans did not even know the weapon existed until after it had been used. That absence, the gap between the magnitude of what was decided and the smallness of the group that decided it, is not incidental to the story of Hiroshima. It is the story. Because the atomic bomb did not reshape the world only through the force of its explosion. It reshaped the world because it revealed, with brutal clarity, What happens when the power to destroy becomes too vast for ordinary democratic processes to govern? The men in that conference room were not uniquely ruthless. They were not uniquely indifferent to human life. They were the individuals the wartime system had placed in that position, at that moment, with that weapon and that authority. And the system had given them the power to choose. No one asked the people of Hiroshima. No one asked the people of Japan. No one asked the American public what city, if any, should be erased from the map. A handful of men made the decision. It was carried out. The city was destroyed. And the only thing that stood between that choice and the history of the world was a small group of officials in a Washington conference room, working with the tools and the logic available to them, deciding which place on Earth would disappear.